Welcome to the show, SEC Football Live. Braden Gall here on the 440 Sports Network, and that is Sam Kham from The Athletic, all things expertise on the state of Texas. I was just in your lovely state. I ate lots of great Tex-Mex and lots of great brisket. It was wonderful. How are you, sir? Welcome to the show.
I'm great. That's the only way to do Texas. It's brisket and Tex-Mex, man. You can't go wrong doing some barbecue and some good enchiladas or tacos or all that good stuff.
It was enjoyable. It was enjoyable. All right, so lots of stuff to discuss with you today on the show, and we do appreciate you coming on. First of all, tell everybody what you guys got coming on The Athletic and the show until Saturday. Tell everybody where they can find you. Do some self-promotion here.
Yeah, of course, theathletic.com. Our college football page is chock full of great coverage every single day. We obviously are ramping up for the season coming up here in August. And then on the podcast side, the Until Saturday podcast is our college football podcast. And during the season, we're going to be going, Monday through Friday. And then, of course, we'll have our Saturday reaction shows at night. And what we've had a rotating cast of hosts. Chris Vanini and David Ubben will be kind of the main two, but I'll be in there in the feed quite a bit as well as a lot of our other talents. So make sure to just get that wherever you get your podcasts. We love talking ball and we love having fun too.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. And I want to start super broadly with you because one of the things that I came away with from media days for the SEC was, talking to a lot of folks that I've known for a long time and respect in the business, and sort of everybody has opinions. We all have different teams that we like more or less than the other team. There wasn't a lot of news in Dallas. Kirby talked about finding players per se instead of or withholding money. But other than that, it is what it is. It's sort of a celebration of the kickoff of the league. But I did find myself, because of how unprecedented this season could be structurally on the field, and because there's so many good quarterbacks at such high places, so many good teams, including Texas, I found myself like way more excited about the football that's going to happen because there are so many people that like so many teams. It can't all be true, Sam. Like people have to lose football games this year somehow.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, and I think about that with the Big 12 too, because that's a 16-team league now, and when you go through it, like the top 6 teams, maybe even 8, you could make legitimate arguments for winning the conference. So, but when you start to predict records, everybody can't be 10-2. It just doesn't work like that. The math doesn't math, and so this is going to be, in my opinion, a real wake-up call for fans of certain programs on how to readjust your expectations on what a successful season in college football is. The days of 12-0 and 11-1, especially in the SEC and these large conferences that are now 16 or more teams, it's just going to be really difficult. The schedules are so much harder. It's not going to be, well, we play 3 tomato cans in non-conference and then we have 1 or 2 really tough conference games. It's not going to work like that. You have multiple big time programs on your schedule every week. Even if you miss one big time program, you're going to probably get some other ones on there. So we're going to have to recalibrate how we think about what a successful or a great season in college football is. And I think the college football playoff in this new 12-team format is going to help with that, because we're used to the 4-team where you had to be either undefeated or 1 loss. We never had a 2-loss team in it. Now we're probably going to have 3-loss teams getting into the postseason bracket. So it's going to be fascinating to see how us as a media and as a fans, as a viewing public, adjust to what we think is great success in college football.
I think the 3-loss thing is really interesting because I think Texas is an example of this, where like I think they're going to lose to A&M. I've said that all summer. I'm guaranteeing A&M victory, which is of course a very dangerous thing to do. But I just think that I lived in Austin for 3 years. I lived in Dallas for 3 years. For those SEC fans in Columbia, Knoxville, and Gainesville that don't understand that will be the single greatest night of atmosphere in all of college football in the entire country, is going to be what Kyle Field is going to be like, especially if Mike Elko and the Aggies are maybe as good at the end of the year as we expect them to be. Again, that's a perfect example. They could be 9-2 with a bunch of really good wins and a couple of really, really what you would call very good losses. And if you lose that game on the road to an arch rival, how it is, and it's close, let's say, I know there's a lot of ifs in this question, but if that happens, do you trust the committee? It's the same thing with losing in a conference championship game, frankly. Do you trust the committee to value the strength of schedule, or are we still just in this, we really don't have a clue how they're going to value things?
I don't think we do have much of a clue, just because I feel like the criteria has changed so much. And there really is no true set criteria. The college football playoff allows its committee members to select the best teams based on whatever they see fit. Some people may think that's strength of schedule. Some people may think that's the eye test. Some people may take metrics into consideration. Now, there's to take all those things into consideration, but that's such a moving target. And so I hesitate to say I would have any trust in the committee because of especially what we saw at the end of last year with the Alabama and Florida State discussion at the end. You just don't know what's going to happen. And so the one great thing about the 12-team playoff that I love is that we at least have automatic bids. So we're going to have 5 teams earn their way in. They're going to win their conference, and then they're going to get one of those top 4 seeds. And then, of course, you're going to have your group of 5 highest ranked conference champion in. Then the rest is up for debate. That's where it's going to get real dicey. And so what does a 10-2 Big 12 team look like versus a 9-3 SEC team?
Yep.
And when we say strength of schedule, do we mean brands or do we mean how good those teams actually are? Because I think sometimes we can conflate how big a brand is with how good that team actually is. It may look good that you played Auburn, but if Auburn was 6-6, is that really a quality win for you?
Well, then where does Texas fall into that? Because they could be both, right? They could be the big brand, but they also could be good enough. Even if they were to lose to Oklahoma on the last play of the game, that would be very Texas Oklahoma-y, very normal. Oklahoma is going to be a good football team. They may not be great this year, but they've got their schedule is going to be a part of that. And so what is Texas from this situation? Because you could have a 1-point loss to Georgia and a 3-point loss to Oklahoma and a 3-point loss to A&M, beat everybody else pretty handily. Although last year they were in way too many dogfights to be considered an elite team necessarily. But where's Texas in that situation? Are they being propped up because of their brand and because they won a championship last year and because Quinn Ewers has got the big name and Sark is the big name, and or are they actually good enough to be worthy of getting in with that kind of schedule?
Well, the great thing is that they do have those opportunities to prove because they're going to have week 2 at Michigan. You have Oklahoma and Georgia in back-to-back weeks. You're going to have A&M at the end of the season. You even have a Kentucky team that is probably going to be pretty good. So
Florida.
They're going to have you got Florida on here, which is an interesting spot. Gosh, you want to talk about tough schedules. Florida's probably got the toughest one out there.
Yeah.
But Texas is going to have a chance to prove itself. If they go 2-2 against those 4 that I just mentioned, Michigan, Oklahoma, Georgia, A&M, and they beat everybody else at 10-2, to me, they're in. To me, that's a pretty good resume if you beat 2 of those 4 and then beat everybody else. And then I don't know if that gets you in the SEC championship. That's another thing is like who gets into the conference championship games in these things. We don't know how that's going to work because I guess it depends on, are you splitting Georgia and A&M? Are you beating both of those teams? How is that going to work as it relates to your conference record? So that's going to be interesting. And that's the other question is, where do the conference championships fall into this discussion? So a 10-2 Texas, if they don't play in the conference championship, and how do they compare to the conference championship game loser in the SEC? Like the team that loses that title game versus Texas, if they didn't get in at 10-2, I'd be curious to see how the committee weighs that.
Yeah, it's funny. I said this to somebody. I think Georgia, for example, has a better chance of getting into the playoff than winning the SEC championship. And I think I could say the same thing about Texas. Like, I think there's a better chance they make the playoff than win the conference title. And I don't know what that means. Like, I don't know.
It means the leagues are too big. That's what it means.
Well, yeah.
It means the conferences are way too big. And that's a topic for another show. But that's what it is. Is the conferences they were not conceived to be this large at its outset. They were conceived to be regional consortiums with all these nearby schools close to playing each other and preserve rivalries, and we're just not there anymore. So they're just really big media rights partnerships is kind of the way I look at it now.
So in the height of talking season here, before actual football pads get put on a football field and football players do football things, Texas, there's this big conversation, and you've sort of seen it with TCU going from the Mountain West, Utah now, of course, jumping into the Mountain. We've seen Cincinnati and Louisville do this. We've seen Missouri and A&M, frankly, do a pretty good job of jumping into the SEC and finding success right away. Is this sort of like they lose to Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy? That's I think the bigger concern for Texas than any of the other stuff that people talk about. Is Texas situated to handle that schedule that we're talking about? I had Alabama 2 on my ballot. I think they're actually a little undervalued in all of this. I think Texas is a very good team. I think they're a playoff team, and I think they've got a chance to win the whole thing if Quinn Ewers is elite. I don't know if he's going to be or healthy. Are they closer to 9-3 and missing the playoff, or are they closer to 12-0? Like, where is Texas in terms of how equipped they are to handle the week in, week out grind of the schedule?
Yeah, I think they're pretty well equipped just for a couple of reasons. One, they got the chance to see what it looked like last year, not in the week to week grind, but in terms of playing elite competition, being able to go to Alabama and win in Alabama. And I know this was not the same Alabama, but that's still a place that very, very few teams win. And so to be able to do that and do it in the fashion that they did, they had the ball for the last 7+ minutes and ran it right at Alabama. So when you look at the line of scrimmage talent that Steve Sarkisian and his staff have recruited, it's not just top end talent. They've got pretty good depth too. And they've done a good job both in recruiting and in the portal shoring that up. So from a top to bottom talent standpoint, I think they're pretty well equipped. I do think they have enough coming back from a talent and a leadership standpoint to bring some continuity after having some success. This is not the Texas from 10 years ago where, they were just a culture mess. They are actually pretty sound, pretty solid. Sark has the same 3 coordinators, offensive, defense, special teams, all 4 years that he's been there now. That stability helps. And I thought they answered the questions last year because they lost after 2022, they lost 2 really big time players and leaders in their locker room, Bijan Robinson, Roschon Johnson. And I had big questions like who's gonna be those guys now to be the locker room culture guys. And they were able to find other guys to do that. And so I have less question about that. My biggest question with them is the one you posed, is interior defensive line. Tavondre Sweat, Byron Murphy no longer there. Are Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton, are they ready to take that step? Are they able to take the leap that those 2 guys took? And it's not just them, it's also the rotation behind them. Are they going to be able to roll guys in the way they did? Because Murphy and Sweat were not on the field all the time. They were on the field, a little bit more than half the time, but Texas was pretty deliberate about rotating guys in. As Steve Sarkisian has said earlier this year, especially the first 4 games of the year, they're going to play a ton of guys because they're hoping to play till January 20th, which is obviously going to be the longest college football season we've ever had. So he not just for his team's depth and development, but to be able to survive and make it to late January, they're going to try to play as many guys as possible. So we're going to find that out, I think, early because they're going to get to play Michigan and get to play Donovan Edwards and that running game. So we're going to find out some answers to those questions early on whether Texas is good enough up there. And the other question I have is Quinn ready to go from pretty good to elite? Because if they're going to win a national championship, they're going to win an SEC championship, I think he has to take a step forward. I think he's very good. I don't think he's consistent enough to be considered elite top 5 draft pick right now.
Yep. If he's CJ Stroud or one of these other guys that is at the top tier, then Texas can win everything they want. I do think it kind of comes down to him. All right. So I I played middle school football and 1 year of high school football in Austin. And I didn't learn your mama so fat jokes when I was in middle school. I learned Aggie jokes. And I'm not a Texas fan or a Texas A&M fan. I like them both. I love the game. I think I've been to 2 of them in Austin, and it was formidable memories for me, as well as the Cotton Bowl at the Stony Clark stand where I learned how to cuss because of Texas and Oklahoma. So it's clear that Texas and Oklahoma belong culturally and geographically in the conference, and it's going to make for great football. But I know you wrote a recent piece about this, so make sure you go to The Athletic, subscribe, pay for good journalism. Can you even begin to explain to folks who don't know anything about this rivalry, like what it actually means or will be like that Saturday night at the end of the season?
It's going to be pretty crazy, just also because of the layoff that we've had. This game will have not been played for 13 years. And I grew up here in the state of Texas. And what we did every Thanksgiving after we ate Thanksgiving dinner, of course, you watch the NFL during the day, but you watch Texas A&M that night. Or in some cases, it was on Black Friday. We would watch on Black Friday. But that was just what you did. It didn't matter if you went to any of the schools. It didn't matter if you were a fan of any of the schools. You just watched it because it was the 2 most prominent programs and most prominent football teams in the state of Texas at the college level going at it. And you just knew that there is a different level of intensity because these are players who, in a lot of cases, played against each other at the high school level or maybe played together on the same team at the high school level. Their colleges are only 100 miles apart. So there's a proximity there that breeds a rivalry that only that proximity can. It's not like Texas and Oklahoma where you're across state borders. And I think there's more of a healthy respect between Texas and OU than there is a hatred. I know there is plenty of hatred between those, but I feel like it's more petty in Texas and Texas A&M. The reason why I say that too is because for the last 13 years they haven't played. But guess what? If you go to the message boards of Texas fans, the longest threads with the most responses are ones about A&M. If you go to the A&M message boards, the longest threads with the most responses are about Texas. They haven't played football for 13 years, but they're talking about recruiting, or they're talking about what the other head coach did, or what this player did.
Jim Schlossnagel.
Jim Schlossnagel, that kind of got it charged up a little bit. I wrote about that right after it happened. I said, 2 days before they entered the SEC, Texas hired Texas A&M's baseball coach right after they went to the College World Series. That's a way to rekindle a rivalry and reignite it in a real way. And I can promise you, Texas A&M fans were very, very, very fired up about that whole thing.
Yep.
And so that rivalry will stretch beyond football. You talk about atmospheres. I would be really curious to see what it's like at Bluebell Park in the spring when Texas goes to Texas A&M. It's going to be pretty crazy. But it's just, it's that neighborly rivalry where you're so close, but there's a pettiness to it because they're both fighting for supremacy. They're both fighting for the same recruits. They're both fighting to be the brand in the state of Texas. And I think that's going to create a charged atmosphere unlike any other.
I want to quickly ask about that because, again, like I had some, experience covering some guys in the recruiting world down there for a while. And you've got Oklahoma, which is a huge brand in the state of Texas. Obviously, Texas and A&M are huge. Texas Tech has a much larger alumni base than I think anybody in the SEC probably realizes in the state. LSU had sort of made inroads into the state as well with the A&M thing. Can you try? And you've got Baylor there and TCU there. Can you try to explain, like, what do folks outside of the state not understand about the recruiting dynamics in the state from like a brand standpoint? That A&M had gained ground on Texas, but Texas is still the brand. How does Oklahoma fit into this? And then how do some of the other schools in the area, like, explain the dynamics on the recruiting trail in the state of Texas?
Yeah, first of all, everybody's here now. It used to be, I feel like 20 years ago, it was a lot of Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas A&M, especially for the elite recruits, for your blue chip guys. And of course, you had national programs coming in here. But now, when A&M moved to the SEC, I think that opened the floodgates. And so you had the whole SEC West coming in here. And then as time has evolved and recruiting has evolved, now you're talking about it's just wide open. Ohio State comes and recruits here. Oregon has come into the state of Texas and recruited in a real way. And then, of course, during that time, Baylor and TCU became prominent programs, and they started to fight for big-time recruits. So it's real fractured. Oklahoma in the Bob Stoops era heavily recruited the state of Texas. They have gone a little bit more national, but they still rely on the state of Texas quite a bit. A&M and Texas obviously still get most of their talent from here, but even those two programs recruit national. Jimbo Fisher was heavily national in his time at Texas A&M. Steve Sarkisian, mostly recruiting the state of Texas, but is not afraid to go tap into the West Coast, not afraid to go into SEC country. So it's a really unique time. And now we have 7 programs competing at the Power 4 level. Now you have SMU in the ACC, you have Houston in the Big 12. So I think it's so much harder to dominate the state. Whereas in the mid 2000s, when Mac Brown was there, I felt like they could almost choose the best 25 guys they wanted. And that's how they had it rolling. I don't know that anybody will ever able to get it back to that way again.
I remember a bunch of stories about like, hey, there's this 3-star kid. He's a really good linebacker. He's committed to Baylor, but he grew up in a Texas family. And as soon as Mac Brown would offer him, he'd switch and go to Texas. Like, does that still the dynamic from a power standpoint? Or are you saying that part of it's changed? Like, all these kids haven't seen other than, I guess 05 and 09, Texas was pretty good, but like, it's not the same anymore is what you're saying?
No, it's not like that. The Texas offer still means a lot. It's funny. I actually did a story like that about that era a few months ago about the Junior Day era. You guys, I'm sure you remember the Mac Brown Junior Day at Texas. They would get in 15 recruits or 20 blue chip recruits, and they would get commitments from 80% of them within the first week. It was bananas how dominant they were at that time. It's still not the same anymore, and for a multitude of reasons. One, as I mentioned, A&M and the SEC got a lot of juice. The Kevin Sumlin era, Johnny Manziel, and the success they had winning the Heisman Trophy that first year and catching a lot of buzz nationally in the SEC, that elevated their image in a way, and they were able to get top flight recruits. Then Jimbo Fisher took it to another level, was able to get, of course, remember the #1 recruiting class a few years ago. And then I think the NIL part has changed it for everybody. That's it. That's a factor now for everybody across country. So that factors in here. But I don't think it's the point where it's like, oh, you get the Texas offer, you get the Texas A&M offer. If they're automatically going to go there, what that does do is for those other programs, if Baylor or Texas Tech or Houston is not in on a kid, or if they're late to the kid before, if Texas or Texas A&M offers them before one of those programs does, it makes it a lot harder for them. They're fighting an uphill battle. And I think it's always kind of been like that, but that part still exists. But I don't think it's the way that it was. Like at LSU, the dynamic that we're talking about, I think still exists in Louisiana, where if you're a Louisiana kid and LSU offers you, that's probably where you're going.
That's a good analogy.
No one else in state's going to take you away. But I don't think anybody owns a state in that way. That said, Steve Sarkisian has had the upper hand here the last couple of recruiting classes and has done a really good job. And Texas overall, their apparatus, from the way they do official visits to their NIL to everything, they have done a really good job of cultivating an atmosphere where they recruit at a really high level.
That's amazing what removing the cooks from the kitchen and alignment and Kevin Elteef and Sarkisian, and it's amazing what all that will do for you. A&M, real quickly here. I think this is going to be an extremely dangerous football team at the end of the year. I don't know how fast it takes them to get to that point. They could play spoiler to a lot of teams. We already mentioned Texas. They got Missouri at home as well. That road trip to Florida, I think, is more dangerous than people realize. They could spoil Notre Dame season in week 1. We all believe in Elko and Mike Elko and sort of the vision behind the hire. We all kind of understand. The question, I think, is how fast does it take them to get up to where they should be? And do you have a sense of, is this a half a season of growth and culture and learning and expectation? Is it the defense is so talented that they can be good right away? What are a reasonable expectation for them finding who they are this season in year 1?
Yeah, I think first of all, improvement. Let's start with that. They need to be better than they were last year. I think what they ended up 7-6 last year. That's not okay considering how much talent they have. So let's start with there. I don't see any reason why this shouldn't be an 8 or 9 win team, but I do think they have the talent on the roster to be a 10-win team, to be a 10-2, maybe in the at-large playoff conversation at the end of the season. They did lose a decent amount in the portal, but when you look at what they did, bringing guys in, I thought, and then also some of the guys they retained Connor Wegman, they retained most of their offensive line. They still do have Noah Thomas at receiver. Moose Muhammad is still there. On defense, they brought in Nick Scorton, the defensive end edge rusher from Purdue, who's I think is going to be a really big time get. They were able to keep Shamar Stewart, which I think was really big. DJ Hicks, their 5-star, will be a freshman will be a sophomore defensive tackle this year. Was true freshman last year. He'll be involved in the mix a little bit more. I just think you talked about the defense. I think they have enough defensive line talent to really be a factor in this season, and they have enough depth because we talk about, okay, Walter Nolan transferred or Fadil Diggs transferred, some of the other guys 3 years ago, they signed 8 defensive linemen in that 2022 class. So there's still a lot of really good, elite, talented guys walking around that facility. And when you watch them practice, they still look like, getting off the bus, they still look like a really good football team. And so to me, if they can get the culture part right, which to me is the biggest reason why they struggled the last couple of years, then I think you've got potential to make some real improvement, because I still think Connor Wegman could potentially be a star. If he can stay healthy, I think he could be a star. They're loaded at running back. They've still got a lot of talented receivers. The offensive line, I think, is a big question. They bring so many of those guys back, but they've been bad the last 2 years. Can they get better? If they can get better, then you got a team that has a potential explosive offense. Elko has been really, really deliberate about laying in the weeds, staying under the radar. Keep your mouth shut. Let's do the work. Because you want to know why? Because for the last 2 years, we've been talking about Texas A&M for Jimbo's contract or the offense or for the recruiting class or for him yapping with Nick Saban. We've been talking about them for every other reason other than what's on the field. And I think Elko's come in and said, you know what? Let's get rid of all this other noise. Let's focus on the work. And then let's let the play speak for itself when we play Notre Dame.
there's a lot of guys. Like I think Brian Kelly's doing that too at LSU. I think Josh Heupel's doing that at Tennessee. I think there's a lot of guys who are like, oh, let's just let everybody else get the coverage right now. What's funny about A&M and how they're constructed, and I think Oklahoma to a lesser extent maybe is constructed in a similar way. This conference feels very top heavy with really good offensive lines and really good quarterbacks. If you look at the teams that we picked at Media Days or picked in Athlon Sports Magazine, at our magazine, you look at the top 7 or 8, it is all teams with really good offensive lines, really good quarterbacks, and really good offenses. And you can go down the list, whether it's Milroe and Bama, Beck and Georgia. We just talked about Ewers in Texas, Nico in Tennessee. You got Brady Cook, Jackson Dart. We can keep going. A&M feels to be built sort of differently. And I think Oklahoma maybe to some degree as well. Like I'm curious if you think going a little different. Defensive lines are always going to be important in big-time college football, but it does feel like Oklahoma's better on the defensive line than they've been in a long time. And I think A&M is certainly as good as anybody in the country with talent. Is there something to them going sort of a different direction? I think Oklahoma might be doing it out of necessity, but it does feel like they're built differently than the rest of the conference.
Yeah, I think so. And part of that, when you talk about Oklahoma, I think that's a nod to who they hired in Brent Venables, because when they made that hire a couple years ago, I remember thinking that was a really smart hire, not just because he had been there and been heavily successful, and not just because he's been a great defensive coordinator at Clemson, but he's been recruiting in those battles because they were winning national championships at Clemson. So they win against the Alabamas and the Georgias and the teams that were built like a national championship team should build. So I knew that when they brought him in, when they start recruiting players, particularly on the line of scrimmage, Brent Venables knows what they look like. And so you know what they're supposed to be. Now it takes time to get there. And like you said, it's out of necessity because you've got to have the depth and talent to do this on a week-to-week basis, because the facts are the facts. The SEC gets more players in the NFL draft every year and typically more linemen drafted every year. And so you're going to be going up against more high-level line of scrimmage talent. And so Oklahoma has been very intentional about that, and that's a credit to Venables and his staff. It's evaluation, it's identification, and it's being able to get those players and hang on to them. So, that like getting Dominic Williams in the portal from TCU, huge. That was a huge win this offseason for them. That was a guy Texas would have loved to have on the interior defensive line, the guy who played as a freshman on a national runner-up at TCU a couple of years ago, and he'll be an impact player for them. Getting guys like that and hanging on to them is critical. And to your point, like A&M was built that way. I don't know if A&M was intentionally built that way. I know that Jimbo wanted big-time defensive line talent, but I think Jimbo in some ways just wanted to get the most talented guys that he could. And that year, it happened to be there was a lot of really talented defensive linemen that they were able to get on board. And that's kind of because I remember looking at that class thinking to myself, why is this class so heavily stacked on the defensive line? Not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but right. You're not going to keep all those guys happy, and it's going to be hard to retain them all. But they're going to benefit from it now because there's still a lot of those guys hanging around on campus. And I do think in the SEC, you have to build your team inside out. This is not to take a shot at other conferences, but I feel like maybe in the Pac-12, they used to build them outside in. In the Oregon era, when Chip Kelly was doing his thing, it was skill, talent, it was speed, it was tempo, and it was a lot of fun. And my colleague Austin Meek at The Athletic wrote about this. When Mario Cristobal got there, they started going inside out. And then Dan Lanning has gotten there, who's got the SEC background. They're going inside out. You've got to win at the line of scrimmage to win in this league and to win national championships. And I think that approach, both by OU and A&M, is a very smart one.
Well, and Saban just said, we're going to do both.
Yes.
Saban's like, I already got all the best offensive and defensive linemen. I'm going to go get some super quarterbacks too. And like, that's where now you have it's the same programs. It's Ohio State, it's LSU, it's, now it might be Texas or whatever, Alabama, Georgia. All right. So I want to ask you about misperceptions. You've been very gracious with your time, so we'll let you go. But I want to ask about misperceptions of the Big 12 from SEC people who maybe don't always watch it. There's been, and I'm curious because I'm this is hitting me because Utah is the pick right now to win the conference because they sort of did something different in the Pac-12 to our exact previous conversation. They were sort of zigging when everyone was zagging. They were going to build this interior trench warfare, physicality, sold out Rice Eccles Stadium, all this really great stuff that if people in the SEC maybe haven't been paying attention to. But I'm curious, like, I see them now matching up with Big 12 teams, and it doesn't feel like the same Big 12 of like, that TCU Baylor game, that West Virginia Geno Smith game with Bryce Petty. I don't know. Do you see the Big 12 has evolved past that? Because Now you see a program like Kansas State that's going to line up on the trenches and beat you. So is there a misperception about the Big 12 that you could tie into Texas and Oklahoma coming into the SEC that would paint a more clear picture for SEC fans of what's taking place in the Big 12? Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I think there used to be this image of the Big 12 was the wide open air raid conference with scored. We remember the Pat Mahomes Baker Mayfield game with Texas Tech and OU with 1,600 yards of offense. One of the most amazing passing displays you'll ever see. But yeah, it's evolved past that for quite a while now, and for a few different reasons. I think you start with Iowa State, John Haycock, and the 3-3 stack and what they've done there defensively. A lot of other programs in the Big 12 have started to emulate that, start to adopt that into their system. TCU used it when they went to the national championship in 2022. Baylor had used some of it a little bit. Even when Matt Rule was at Baylor, he was a very much bring the line of scrimmage and let's be a little bit tougher on at the point of attack kind of coach, different from all the other guys that were in the conference at the time. And I do feel like you mentioned Chris Kleiman in Kansas State. I always feel like they've been different from everybody anyway. And I feel like they're just staying on brand and everybody else is kind of coming back to them. But I think there's an understanding that you have to win when everybody knows you're running the ball. You have to be able to run the ball. And there's a lot of coaches now that I think have embraced that. And some of that is the evolution of the scheme as well. The air raid, Mike Leach, rest in peace, was one of the only ones still running in its original form. Even Dana Holgerson before he got let go at Houston, even Lincoln Riley at USC. So many of these guys have evolved into tweak it to make it palatable to win at this level at this time, because you got to have multiple answers. You cannot just line up in 11 or 10 personnel all the time and expect that it's going to go all rosy. You're going to have a tight end. You're going to have to run the ball in between the tackles. You're going to have to get some stuff done in the red zone. And so many teams have embraced that. And now you bring in Utah, a team that was able to bully some other teams in the Pac-12 at the line of scrimmage. I think they're going to bring an element of that. Kansas State is there. We mentioned some of the others. I think this is going to be a fascinating year in this conference for me, because there's so many teams from so many different backgrounds with so many different coaching styles and really good coaches, by the way.
Yeah.
Kyle Whittingham, Mike Gundy, Chris Kleiman, Lance Leipold. They just brought Willie Fritz in at Houston, who I think is one of the best out there and is very underrated.
Old Gus. Yeah.
Yeah, Gus Malzahn, who has done a terrific job building that roster at UCF so far. They looked, of all the 4 new teams that came in last year, they looked the most ready to join a power conference. And I think you're going to only see that grow with the way they've recruited. They're recruiting at a top 35 level right now. So this is a league that is not top heavy. You're not going to have an Alabama or an Oklahoma or anybody like that. And that's just, I don't know if and when that's going to happen. But the top half, from 1 to 10, is the margin is going to be about this small, and it's going to be a lot of fun to watch, because you're going to get to see those chess matches play out, those matchups play out, and it's going to be a lot of fun on Saturday.
I think the Big 12 is like a neighborhood that is going through a major gentrification. Like I
yes,
it's just like,
that's a good way to put it.
You got totally different houses with different architecture and different people with different backgrounds doing different things, and it's just going to be utterly fascinating to watch.
There's no HOA in this conference, none.
No, I think it benefits Texas and Oklahoma that evolution has taken place in that conference over the last, let's say, 7 or 8 years. And I think, honestly, if you're, all joking aside, if you're asking for who's going to be the team that rises, it'll be Florida State when they join the league. When Florida State comes, they'll be the top dog in the conference. But tell everybody where they can find you and follow you and get to your work. It's going to be a fascinating year in both conferences, frankly.
Yeah, theathletic.com on our college football page. You can search our names. You'll find our stuff on there. And then on Twitter at SCon Jr., I still once in a while tweet, not as often as I used to. So you can find me on there too. I'm SCon Jr. on everything. Any social media that exists, I'm on there at SCon Jr.
I don't hang out on the Nazi dive bar as much anymore. It's not as fun. All right, last one. I'll let you go. Better food, Houston, Dallas, or Austin?
Oh, Houston, by a mile, by a country mile, because of the variety. That's the thing. It's Austin is probably, or Central Texas has the lock on the barbecue scene. Houston's been much better on that in the last 10 years. But you have one part of town, you can have barbecue, you can have Texas, but you can have Vietnamese, You
Yeah.
can have all kinds. You can have Indian food. My father was Pakistani, so there's all kinds. Whatever you're looking for, you can find it in the H. And so
There you go.
there's so many cultures and so many different places to go. If you cannot find a place to eat in Houston, it's because you didn't try. That's basically it.
And that is a perfect way to end it. Go get some food in Houston. Follow him, of course. You can get to him on the socials and The Athletic as well. Always a pleasure seeing you, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us. And, of course, for everybody listening, please rate, review, subscribe, share the show, all that great stuff as well. We're just a couple of weeks away from camp. Thank you guys for hanging out and listening. My name is Braden Gall. This has been SEC Football Live.